I kept quiet for decades because I chose to love two men in the midst of war. My name is Wilhelmina Esther Pratt. I'm 87 years old, and I live alone in an old house in Portland, Maine. If you were to look around me now, you'd see a dining room, frozen in time, a china cabinet filled with my mother's china, heavy drapes I rarely leave open, and an empty chair where no one sits anymore. This is where I spend most of my days, sipping lukewarm tea, listening to the wall clock tick, and trying not to overthink. But today, I couldn't help myself. Today, a silly sound, the snap of a metal lid falling onto the counter, took me back to a place I'd tried to forget for over 70 years. It took me into a field hospital in the middle of a war that devoured men and hopes with equal hunger. It was there that I served as a nurse, a young American, full of will, too scared to admit it. I thought I was going to save lives. Little did I know I would end up burying parts of my own soul. Back then, the smell was always the same. Fresh blood mixed with expired disinfectant. The tent canvas fluttered in the wind, and the sheets were never truly clean. Still, there were moments of silence, and it was in those intervals that something no one ever knew happened. Because amidst the pain and confusion, I found myself torn between two soldiers. Two men who arrived together, wounded, covered in mud, and who left carrying different pieces of my heart. This grandmother's true story isn't about betrayal, nor about scandal. It's about what war creates, and time later buries. A love lost in war, a gesture never spoken aloud, and a guilt I learned to carry like someone carrying a medallion on their chest. Heavy, silent, eternal. I don't know if you've ever experienced a love like this. One that tore you in two, that never became a photograph, but that still wakes you in the middle of the night. I did. And today, I'm going to tell you. If this story touches you, if at any point you feel like it could be your mother, your grandmother, or even yourself, write to me in the comments. I want to know, would you have chosen, or would you have remained silent like me? And if you want to hear other stories of forbidden love, of nurses who experienced what no one dares to tell, subscribe to the channel. Here we don't forget, we finally speak. It was a silly sound, the kind you hear 1,000 times and don't even notice. A dry metallic click coming from the kitchen. I think the lid of one of my cans fell to the floor and rolled until it hit the counter. But in that instant, that small sound became a thunderclap in my chest. It froze me in my chair. It took me to another place, another time. A place I'd avoided for so long, I thought it had disappeared. But the truth is, it never went away. It just remained quiet, like a whisper hidden under the rug of my memory. The noise reminded me of a gesture, of one of them. How he'd closed the bandage case too tightly, always irritated by the stuck zippers. It was just a detail. But that sound, that dry snap, was exactly the same. And that's when it all came rushing back. The smell of damp canvas, the taste of dust, the fear pulsing in the pit of my stomach. And along with all of that, the most uncomfortable memory of my life returned. Having loved two men at the same time, and never having told anyone about it. For a long time I convinced myself this wasn't a love story. And if it was one of those we shouldn't tell. It wasn't pretty, nor right. It was confusing, wrong maybe, but true. And war has this strange power. It messes with your feelings, jumbles your days, and gives you bits of happiness amidst the horror. I didn't betray anyone. I didn't lie to anyone. But I carried a kind of guilt no one gave me. I gave myself, because when the war ended, one of them never came back, and the other married my cousin. I spent decades pretending this story was just a crazy dream, something I imagined. A youthful delusion. Because how do you tell someone you're heartbroken to and never reunited? How do you explain that sometimes love doesn't choose one? It's divided, and neither side wins. Today, almost 90 years old and all my mirrors covered in scarves, I decided to tell you, because one of them didn't even have a grave. And the other, well, he pretended not to see me the last time we crossed paths. So if you want to hear it, I'll tell you. Not because I think I'm special, nor because my story is sadder than anyone else's, but because maybe, just maybe, you over there also loved someone you never knew. Or worse, you loved two hearts and kept it all in yours. And if that's the case, know that you are not alone. I remember the color of the mud exactly. It was a pasty mixture of dark red and ochre, almost a thick clay that stuck to their boots as if it had a life of its own. It was in this mud that they arrived, one helping the other walk, both covered in dust and dried blood. One with his shoulder bandaged haphazardly, the other gritting his teeth in pain, but trying to smile. They entered the makeshift barracks together, without ceremony, as if that worn floor were the last solid ground before the sinking. I was spreading the sheets when I saw it. They were young, handsome, but more than that, there was an intimacy between them that confused me. For a second, I thought they were brothers, but then I realized they weren't. It was just the complicity of those who share a foxhole, silence, and fear. The quieter one looked me straight in the eye. The other thanked me loudly, with that southern accent I'd only heard in movies. And it was in that instant, without a single romantic word, without a touch, without anything, that something inside me split. My heart, which until then had been whole, became two branches growing in opposite directions. Their boots, wet and heavy, left tracks on the freshly spread sheet. Fine dust, almost golden in the weak sunlight that filtered through the canvas. And I, who would previously have been irritated by any dirt on my work, stood there, staring at those marks as if they were a warning. It was as if fate were telling me, "Pay attention, girl. You'll never be the same again." That sheet, with its clinging dust, became a kind of symbol for me, an altar, and for a long time I avoided changing it. War takes so much from us, but before it does, it offers you illusions. Those two boys were, deep down, one of those illusions. A piece of beauty amidst the horror, a piece of choice where there was no freedom. And I, with my stained apron and my hands still calloused, felt for the first time that perhaps love was also a way of surviving. I said nothing. I just folded the edge of the sheet more carefully. But inside me, a story had already begun. And this story, it grew slowly in the corners of the field hospital, like mold on a damp wall. It was there, in that seemingly banal scene, that it all began. And even now, so many years later, I still remember the sound of boots stomping on the ground, and the strange sensation that my chest had begun to split. On that morning of mud and weak sunlight, without warning, my heart split in two directions. It was quick, so quick that if I hadn't stopped breathing for a second, I might not have even noticed. We were in the dressing room, me preparing the bandages, him waiting with his head down, his gaze lost somewhere beyond the tent. And then, just as I turned to grab the scissors, I felt his hand touch mine. It wasn't a squeeze. It was just a brush of fingers like someone who needs support for a moment but doesn't want to be seen. And no one saw it. Only I felt it. His skin was warm, even in the early morning chill. His fingers, rough and tense, carried the silence of someone who had already lost more than they could count. And I, foolish as I was, pretended not to understand. I continued with my task, my hand trembling and my heart on high alert, as if someone had opened a door inside my chest. The gesture was small, but there, amidst so much screaming and blood, it was the most human touch I would receive in weeks. The problem was that, even before that touch, I already had feelings for the other man. The more communicative one, the one who told bad jokes and always found a way to make me laugh between one wound and the next. He gave me nicknames, offered me hidden pieces of chocolate, and looked at me as if I were the only woman alive in that field. With him, everything was clear, visible, spoken, and therefore easier. But the other man, the one who touched my hand silently, he said everything without saying a word, and that hurt more. I still wonder to this day, how many loves begin in silence? How many unnoticed touches were actually screams trapped between ribs? That gesture confused me more than any words, because there, in the warmth of a hand on mine, I felt a request to stay, to see, to understand. But time was cruel, and war even more so, and I didn't know what kind of woman I was, the one who laughed at jokes, or the one who listened to the silence. I kept pretending there was no choice, pretending my heart was still just one. But in that dressing room, where bodies were patched together and souls slowly unraveled, my fate began to change. And that touch, that brief, almost invisible touch, was the first real crack in the shell I'd worn. From that moment on, nothing was the same. And I too, ceased to be. Their quarters were near the supply area, half hidden among sheds, with an old tarp serving as a door. I only went in when someone needed morphine or when the doctors asked to check for nocturnal fevers. That day I went to get antibiotics. The smell inside was a mix of grease, old sweat, and damp paper. And then I saw the poster, a blonde pin-up, the kind you see in folded magazines, taped to the wall with worn tape. But what caught my eye wasn't the girl's body. It was the bottom corner, where someone had drawn a flower in red paint. The flower was simple, almost childlike. A curved stem, 3 trembling petals, a solitary gesture made by hand, perhaps in a moment of boredom or longing. But I recognized that drawing. It was the same one that would appear, days later, in a note left in my locker, unsigned, with nothing but that flower, repeated in dark red. And there, with the glass of the antibiotic vial still warm in my hand, I understood. It was his. Of what touched me silently, of what kept everything inside my heart. From that day on, I began to see it everywhere. The flower, in the corners of trays, on the back of used paper, even on a napkin discarded near the cafeteria, as if it wanted to tell me it was there, watching, waiting, loving, perhaps, but without demanding anything. And I, who had always been so practical, so correct, began to live in 2 worlds, one with the boy who made me laugh out loud, and another with the one who wrote to me silently. I began collecting those papers like someone collecting clues to a secret. I folded each one carefully and hid it between the pages of my nursing notebook. When I read them alone at night, I felt a strange sensation, as if I were betraying someone, even though I hadn't promised anything to anyone. I began to fear that everything would fall apart, but I was also afraid of losing. And that's when war truly captures you, when the fear of living mixes with the fear of forgetting. The truth is, I began to love a ghost, a man who didn't say it, only hinted, a love that was more presence than touch. And at the same time, I slept beside another, one who spoke to me constantly, who existed before everyone's eyes. I tore myself apart inside, and since no one understood, I thought everything was fine. But nothing was, And inside me, my heart had already chosen. Only life didn't know it yet. I found the letter early before breakfast, folded with millimeter precision between the sheets in the outpatient clinic. 3 precise folds, as if he'd taken a long time to decide to deliver it. The paper was slightly damp, with a faint trace of blood on one corner, a detail that only made it all the more real. I read it there, my hands still cold, and my eyes tired. A simple request. Behind the laundry room. Tonight, if I can. No signature. Just the red flower drawn in the corner. I folded the note slowly, and without thinking twice, tucked it into my sock, right next to my ankle. I wanted to feel the paper there all day long, like a memory pulsing between skin and fabric. But along with that presence came a weight. I walked the corridors as if carrying a secret between my bones. I smiled at the doctors, tended to the wounded, checked their medications, all with my heart elsewhere, debating between courage and cowardice, between 2 names never spoken aloud. Throughout the shift, I considered going, and also not going. With every step, I changed my mind. With every distant explosion, with every soldier's groan of pain, I was reminded that love was a dangerous invention, and yet a part of me begged for that encounter. But at the end of the day, when the sky darkened and the generators began to fail, as usual, I didn't go. I sat on my bed, shoes still on, feeling the sweaty paper against my skin, and trying to pretend that was enough. I never told anyone I received that letter. I never even told myself, properly. I kept it a secret as if it were a moral failing, an error of judgment. But looking back now, with everything I know and everything I've lost, maybe the mistake was something else. Maybe the real mistake was the fear of choosing. Because that night, as I sat there, trying to protect what was impossible to keep intact, I lost both. A little. And I wonder how many lives were shaped by unanswered letters. How many destinies were decided by steps we didn't take. That night, behind the laundry room, there was someone waiting, and I didn't go. Not out of malice, not out of disinterest, but out of fear. Fear of hurting, fear of making mistakes, and most of all, fear of burying a love before even experiencing it. It was a night when the sky seemed too still. Those rare pauses between attacks, when we could almost pretend the world wasn't falling apart outside. We were in the cafeteria, eating something too lukewarm and tasteless, when someone started tapping a spoon on a metal mug. At first it seemed like a silly joke, but the sound echoed like an invitation. A rhythmic, insistent beat that suddenly became music within us. And he, the more extroverted of the two, stood up and held out his hand to me, laughing. "Let's dance," he said. And I did. He pulled me into the middle of the torn canvas floor, and we spun around like 2 teenagers at an impromptu dance. The mug continued to clang, now accompanied by clapping and a few laughs. I forgot the smell of blood, the pain in my ankles, the letter still tucked inside my pocket Bible. For a few minutes there was nothing but the 2 of us. He made me laugh. He spun exaggeratedly, made faces, stumbled on purpose. And I laughed, really laughed, as if that were the only normal thing left in the world. But as we spun, my eyes wandered, and there in the back, near the dark entrance, was he, the other one, the one who didn't say much, the one who drew flowers in silence. He stood still, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on us. There was no anger in his eyes, no sadness. It was a low, resigned look, like someone who understands everything and no longer has the strength to fight it. In that instant, my laughter dried up, and my body, even though I was still dancing, began to tremble inside. There, in that makeshift war room, I hurt someone I also loved, Maybe unintentionally, maybe carelessly. But I hurt. And worst of all, he saw it. He saw the laughter, the spin, the touch of hands. And he understood I had made a choice, even if my heart told me otherwise. After that night, he didn't draw another flower. At least, not for a while. And I began to understand what guilt without words was. To this day, when I hear metal hitting glass, my chest tightens. I remember the sound of the mug. I remember his hand on my waist. I remember the other man, standing in the shadows, his eyes downcast. And I wonder, how many times does love break like this? In the middle of a made-up song, at the exact moment we laugh out loud, and hurt the one who needed silence most. The rain began as a whisper, almost gentle, as if the sky were simply clearing its throat. But within half an hour, the entire camp was under a downpour. The canvas of my tent collapsed in two, and water invaded everything: mattresses, medicine, instruments. The ground became a swamp, and for some reason only war understands. That day there were no sirens, no bombs, only rain. But it was one of the most violent days I've ever experienced, because there, I realized I could no longer separate love from pain. We all ran to save what we could. Medicines, supplies, papers, everything threatened by that dirty, rushing water. And that's when I saw them. The two of them, together, fighting the same torrent. One slipped first, falling to his knees, his boots sinking in ankle deep. The other laughed, tried to help, but ended up tripping too. They fell on top of each other, laughing like children covered in mud. I ran to them, kneeled there in the mud without thinking, trying to pull them both out with my bare hands. And for a moment, I wanted that moment to last forever. The smell of wet earth mixed with their sweat enveloped me like an ancient perfume. It was the smell of war, yes, but also the smell of both of them. I could feel the warmth of their bodies under my arms, the texture of their soaked clothes, the vibration of their choked laughter. It was an almost absurd scene. The war all around, and the three of us there, laughing in the mud, as if we were characters from a fond memory. But I knew. Deep down I already knew. I wanted to save them both, and I knew, with the same silent certainty, that I couldn't. Fate in this life doesn't let us love like that, abundantly, excessively. It demands it. It chooses for you when you take too long to choose. And in that mud, with my knees scraped and my heart squeezed, I felt it for the first time. That maybe the mistake wasn't loving them both, but pretending that one day I'd be able to emerge whole from that choice. After the rain stopped, we dried ourselves with whatever we could. Handkerchiefs, old towels, floor cloths. No one spoke of what happened. But the trace of those hours stayed with me forever. Because that day, it wasn't just the tents that collapsed. It was also the structure where I hid. This idea that I could love in silence, without causing damage. Deep down, in that mud, a part of me already knew what was coming. And I wasn't ready. It was the day after that storm, when the ground was still damp and the air smelled of rust. Boots sank into the dried mud, leaving deep marks that looked like scars from the ground. I was in the outpatient clinic, sorting disposable items, when he entered without saying anything. His hands were hidden behind him, and his gaze was a mixture of shame and a tenderness I no longer recognized. And then he held out this to me. A small rose made from dirty gauze and a piece of suture thread. A makeshift flower. Fragile. Unlikely. That rose was ugly. It really was. The fabric was dingy, the thread poorly tied. But when he placed it in my hand, I felt like I was receiving something much greater than a gift. It was as if he were saying, without a single word, "This is all I can give you, and it's all I have." I looked at him, and for a moment, the world stopped. No background noise, no shouting, not even the crackling of old light bulbs. Just that meaningful silence between us. I kept the rose more carefully than any medal. I wrapped it in a clean handkerchief and hid it deep in my purse. And to this day, it's with me. Yellowed, faded in places, but alive. Because that flower said what neither of us could ever say clearly. And in that moment, upon receiving that gesture so crude and yet so sacred, I knew who I wanted. He wasn't the most talkative nor the most handsome. He was the one who spoke to me through things no one else saw. But war. War. War doesn't respect these intimate discoveries. It doesn't wait for you to decide. The moment my heart made its choice, life took charge of reminding me that I was in a zone where death chose first. And the rose, although it remained, no longer guaranteed anything. It became a memory before it even became reality. And I carried this as a kind of silent punishment. I could have said something that day. I could have held his hand. I could have asked him to wait for me, to write to me, to survive. But I just thanked him, quietly, like someone receiving a favor, not love. And now I see that that silence was my betrayal. Because while he offered me everything, even without having anything, I was still trying to understand what I could and couldn't feel. And in that hesitation, I lost more than I can count. The night had fallen more stifling than usual. The air was thick, the distant sounds of movement. You could sense something was coming. And it did. First the flashes in the sky, then the roar. Explosions in the distance, but loud enough for us to feel the earth vibrate beneath our feet. Everyone ran to the makeshift shelter behind the barracks, and I ran too. Amidst the confusion, the dust, and the screams of alarms, he pulled me, without warning, without words. He grabbed my arm and led me to a darker corner, where the tarp swayed in the hot wind of the explosion. That's where it happened. The kiss. Quick, urgent, with a taste of fear. His mouth trembled, but it was strong. A kiss born of haste, of uncertainty, of the eagerness to hold on to something that wouldn't explode along with the rest. And I let him. I responded. Because in that moment, any shred of life seemed too precious to reject. But as soon as we pulled away, my chest felt heavy. My body had said yes, but my heart hadn't. My heart had already chosen, and it wasn't him. I remember the sound of the sky at that moment. It was a screaming red. And inside me, another kind of explosion was happening. That of shame. Because no matter how much I tried to justify that gesture with the fear and heat of the moment, I knew I was betraying something. Something that didn't even have a name, that wasn't even official. But it was real. The gauze rose was in my bag, and the taste of the other's kiss now lived in my mouth. And there, amidst sirens and shrapnel, I realized my body was lying, and I let it. Afterwards, we returned to the shelter and pretended normality. He smiled nervously as if nothing had happened, but I couldn't look at him the same way anymore. Not out of anger, but out of guilt. And the other, the one of silence, of flowers, seemed to have disappeared in the following days. I don't know if he saw, if he knew. But the distance between us grew. As if that kiss, besides being wrong, had broken something that was still forming. A bridge between two worlds I could no longer cross. I tried to convince myself it was just an impulse, just a spark in a minefield. But the truth is, sometimes a poorly timed gesture carries more weight than a lifetime of intention. And that kiss, given under a sky red with explosions, remained like a scar, because as much as I wanted to erase it, it said all too loudly what my heart didn't want to admit, that I had failed the man who never asked me for anything, but who gave me everything. The paper arrived in the lieutenant's hands, folded in 4, smelling of smoke and bearing the marks of greasy fingers. It was a common notice back then, a list of redeployment of troops, nurses, and wounded. We received these documents as if they were the results of a cruel lottery. And that day, as I read the list leaning against the mess counter, my eyes fell directly on their names, both of them, and both were crossed out, one with a single dry line, the other with 2 crossed-out dashes, as if they had disappeared from the map, from the mission, from me. My stomach sank. One of the names was marked Missing in Action next to it. The other, Transferred to Mobile Unit. No details. No chance to say goodbye. They disappeared as they had arrived, without warning. I closed the paper with trembling hands and left through the back door. I hid behind the thick mess hall curtain, the one constantly stained with grease and dust, and cried. But it wasn't a pretty cry. It was a suppressed sob, the kind that tears from within but barely makes a sound. No one noticed my absence that day. The routine was so violent that even the pain became invisible. But inside me, something crumbled. It was as if life had punished me, as if, for not choosing, I was now losing them both. And the worst part, not knowing which of them still breathed, not knowing if either of them still thought of me, or if both had already been swallowed by the faceless land of war. I stood there, listening to pots banging in the kitchen and feeling like the world had become smaller. Because my world, for a time, was them. Over the next few weeks, I discreetly asked for information. I tried to strike up conversations with soldiers from other units, reading reports like someone searching for clues in a pictureless puzzle. But all I received were silences, shrugs, and looks of pity. And the pain turned to dust inside me, an accumulation of absences, a pile of words I never said, which now had nowhere to land. Sometimes I think the war didn't just kill those who fell in the fields. It also killed the stories that never happened, the encounters that were cancelled by fate. What hurt me most wasn't the absence. It was the lack of choice. I couldn't say goodbye. I couldn't apologize, or hand over the gauze rose. And ever since, I've carried this emptiness, as if it were a name tattooed on my flesh that no one can see anymore. But that still burns every time I remember that, in my story. The end came without warning. It was a gray afternoon, the kind when even the wind seems tired. The warehouse had been emptied after a hasty evacuation. All that remained were damp pallets, scraps of tarpaulin, and forgotten boxes. I went there to help pack up what was left. But the truth is, I was looking for traces. Any trace of the 2 of them. A handkerchief, a ribbon, a piece of paper scrawled with a red flower. And it was when I bent down to pick up a broken bottle that I saw on the wooden floor something small, round, stained with dried blood. It was a medal, a military medal engraved with initials, his. I knelt there longer than I should have. The world around me faded. Only that cold piece remained in the palm of my hand, still dirty, still alive. It was like holding a piece of him, a fragment that endured, and for a second I believed he was alive, that he had left it for me, like another of his silent messages. But deep down I knew that medal had been left because he hadn't had time to return for it, maybe because he was injured, or maybe because he was no longer with us. I hid it without thinking. I slipped it into the inside pocket of my lab coat and only took it out hours later when I arrived at my dorm. I washed it carefully, scrubbing it with a handkerchief, as if washing an altar. And then, Not knowing where to store something so small and so heavy at the same time, I placed it among my mother's china, inside the china cabinet. No one ever knew. Even today, as I tell you this, it's there behind me, between a flower pot and a cracked-rimmed cup. That metal, it weighs more than any engagement ring I've ever tried on. I kept it as if it were secret proof that love existed, that I wasn't crazy, that he saw me, he chose me, even though the world prevented it. That metal became an anchor, a cruel and tender reminder of everything that couldn't be. And when the war ended, and everyone returned to their silence, I kept it, the metal, the rose, and the absence. Sometimes I think objects hold more than memories. They hold broken promises. They hold pieces of people who never had a chance to be together. And that metal, hidden among inherited porcelain, is my most intimate secret, because it's all that's left of him. And, at the same time, everything that still binds me to a choice I've never been able to make out loud. It arrived months after the war ended. Brown envelopes, stamped with a military stamp and handwriting that made my heart skip a beat before I even opened it. I recognized the lines as soon as I saw them. It was his, the same one who drew flowers in the corners of notes, the one who gave me the gauze rose, the one who held my hand unseen. The letter was intact, folded with precision, as if he still wrote from that same place of silence and care. And I could only cry before reading it. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside, he asked how I was. He said he was in Ohio, with scars on his arm, but alive, that he'd dreamed about me, that he thought about the unspoken conversations, the hidden gestures. He made no demands. He just said that if I wanted him, he'd be there, waiting. It was a simple letter. No grandiose declarations. But the lack of exaggeration only made it all the more real. It was as if he still knew me, and offered me, once again, that quiet love, in his own way. But I didn't reply. Not because I didn't want to, but because I was paralyzed. Because I still felt indebted to the other. The one who kissed me in the shelter. The one who shared laughs with me in the rain. The one who was now part of the family. By bonds I hadn't expected. I was afraid of seeming ungrateful. Afraid of seeming unfaithful. Afraid of seeming too alive for someone buried only in memories. So I left the letter in the drawer. And over time, it turned to dust of oblivion. I reread it every now and then. I thought about writing back. I even grabbed paper and a pen, even stamped an empty envelope. But I never sent it. And as the years passed, I kept telling myself it was too late, that he should have moved on by now, that I should have too. But it was a lie. The truth is, every time I touched that letter, I felt as if I were touching what could have been my entire life, if I'd only had the courage. Today that letter is kept with the gauze rose and the medal, a small reliquary of what I didn't experience. And sometimes I wonder, what if I had written back? What if you had gone all the way to Ohio? Maybe he'd still be waiting for me at that station I never saw. Maybe not. But what hurts me is that I'll never know, because fear spoke louder. And now, only the paper holds the story. The church was filled with too many white flowers. The sweet scent made me feel a little nauseous, perhaps because of the mix of cheap perfume and pent-up nostalgia. I didn't want to go, but I went. I went because it was family, because my cousin had always been close to me, because no one knew the whole story. And I also went because, deep down, I already knew. I knew he would be there. And when I entered the nave, with the pews full and the candles lit, confirmation came with a dull thud in my chest. He was at the altar. Not as the groom, but as the best man. It was the other one. The one who kissed me in the shelter. the one who made me laugh between the war breaks. He wore a dark suit, and his hair, now graying at the sides, was slicked back. He seemed taller than I remembered, more serious. He saw me, and didn't smile. He just lowered his eyes, as if asking for forgiveness and saying goodbye at the same time. That silent gesture tore me apart. I sat in the third row, and throughout the ceremony, I didn't hear a word that was said. All I heard was the repeated sound of a spoon hitting a mug, the sound of our dance that was never a dance. As the bride and groom exchanged vows, all I could stare at was the line of his jaw, his hands clasped in front of him, the way he looked away every time our eyes almost met. There was no anger, no resentment, just an ancient lament, like two ships that passed each other on a dark sea and never stopped. Life followed paths we didn't choose, and the only thing left was this thick silence between us, the same one that had haunted me since my hospital days, only now wearing a tie. After the ceremony, I approached the exit without making a fuss. No one stopped me. He was surrounded by relatives, smiles, hugs. But for a moment, before I walked through the door, he turned. He said nothing. He just looked at me with those downcast eyes again, as if to say, "We lost each other," without ever finding each other. And that was worse than any words, because words have an end. But what we were left with was only absence and memory. I returned home with my shoes hurting and my chest raw. I lay down on the bed without taking off my dress and cried silently, because there, amidst too many flowers and promises exchanged with others, I realized that life had decided for me. And as in every untold love story of war, the ending didn't come with applause. It came with a shy wave, a broken look, and the certainty that time doesn't restore what we buried in silence. It was a lazy autumn when I finally decided to rummage through the basement. Dry leaves scraped against the window, and the smell of mold and remembrance filled the air. I found everything down there. Old toys, broken Christmas decorations, suitcases no one used anymore. And then, at the bottom of a crooked shelf, I saw the tin. One of those decorated cookie boxes, the lid loose and dented on one side. I opened it out of curiosity, expecting to find buttons or old thread. But I found what dismantled me: letters, photographs, and among them, a forgotten image that pierced me. It was a small, faded photo, its edges torn by time. And there they were, the two of them, side by side, covered in mud, laughing like two boys who'd just escaped a prank. One of them, the silent one, had the gauze rose tucked into his uniform pocket. The other held a crooked helmet to his head, mocking some joke I'll never hear again. That frozen moment took me by surprise, as if life were showing me, decades later, that what we experienced was real, that it wasn't a figment of my longing. I sat on the cold basement floor, the photo in my hands, my throat tight. I saw there the youth that war took, the bond I couldn't hold, and above all, the truth no one ever knew. They seemed happy, whole, as if the world for a moment had given them a respite. And I was the crack in the middle, the thin line that divided them unintentionally, the girl with shallow eyes who loved them in silence and kept quiet when she most needed to scream. That image haunted me for nights. I placed the photo in a small frame, hidden behind books on my bookshelf. No one ever asked about it, and I never explained. But there's what remains of my story. Two boys in uniform, a mutual smile, and a gauze flower in the pocket. It's not much, but that's all. Because sometimes what remains is just an image, and what doesn't remain is what shapes us most. I understood, in that cold basement, that some loves don't need to be lived to their fullest to change a life. that some true stories of grandparents like mine don't have a happy ending, nor a clear beginning. They only have a middle, half messy, half silent, half eternal. And that photo, kept for decades, still speaks to me. More than many words I've heard in my entire life. Getting here wasn't easy. Not for lack of words, but for the weight of them. Because now, looking back with more wrinkles on my face than certainties in my soul, I can say, yes, I loved them both. One with the laughter, the touch, the impulse. The other with the silence, the hidden gesture, the look that pleaded and then retreated. But only one of them loved me without trying to possess me. Only one offered me love as if offering shelter, without locking the door, without making promises. And it was that one who left me marked for the rest of my life. The happiest one gave me visible memories. The kiss in the shelter, the improvised dance, the place at the altar at my cousin's wedding. But the other gave me what cannot be seen. The notes with flowers, the gauze rose, the medal that fell into the shed. He gave me spaces to fit in, without demanding form. He gave me silence as if it were a complete declaration. And he loved me with a patience that never demanded reciprocated love. It was this love, the quiet one, the one that doesn't shout, that remained. Not a day goes by that I don't think about what might have been. If only I had gone to Ohio. If only I had written back. If only I had danced with him instead of with the other guy. But that's what life is. A bunch of ifs piled up behind our eyes, and a bunch of maybes that we learn to keep hidden. I never knew if he waited for me. I never knew if he forgave me. But I know that, until the end, he loved me in his own way. Quietly, deeply, completely. And the greatest pain wasn't the loss. It was the silence I maintained. It was not saying, "Me too." It was not holding his hand on the day of the rose. It was not running to him after the letter. Because deep down, it wasn't just him who loved me in silence. I loved him that way too. And maybe that's why it hurt so much. Because there was never time to transform love into life. And life went on without him. Today all I have left is an ownerless medal, a gauze rose that refuses to fade, and a name that lives where no one sees. Because some names, when spoken, dismantle everything. And this one, his, is still whole here inside. You don't need to be spoken, because all true love survives even in silence. If I've learned anything from this story, it's that there are silences that last longer than any war. We think they'll disappear over time. But no, they just change location. They leave the throat and hide in the chest. I held on to this secret for over 7 decades, not out of shame, but out of fear of facing what I let slip by. Because deep down, this isn't just an exciting love story. It is untold love story of war, the kind no one writes about in books and that don't fit on medals or monuments. I loved 2 men, and I lost them both in different ways. One I took with me as a memory. The other I let slip away out of cowardice. And to this day, when I run my finger along the frame of that forgotten photo, I feel that my heart still holds a space where neither of them could fully fit. Perhaps you, who have listened to me thus far, have experienced something similar. A feeling that didn't have time to become a choice, a story that was never told, a forbidden love, forgotten, silent, but still breathing within you. And if that's the case, don't blame yourself. Not every day. Just acknowledge it. Because sometimes, acknowledging it is the beginning of a forgiveness we need to give ourselves. Tell me here in the comments, have you ever kept a love silent? Have you ever lost someone because you took too long to say what you felt? I want to know. And if you want to hear more stories like this, Stories that lived inside grandparents like me. Stories of war, care, loss, and love. Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. There is a lot of life hidden in the silence of the women who cared while everything fell apart. Because the truth is, the strongest love isn't always the one that's been lived. Sometimes it's the one that's never been said. But that still beats, even after everything.